darkness was absolute when my eyes first opened. A heavy and silent blanket that seemed to press against the rough wool of my blanket. I lay still for a long moment, listening to the rhythm of the house. There was the soft, rhythmic breathing of my wife beside me, and from the far corner of the room, the faint rustle of dry straw where the children slept. The air was cold, sharp with the lingering chill of late autumn, carrying the scent of old wood smoke and the musty, earthy smell of unwashed wool. It was the hour before the dawn, the time when the world belonged to the spirits and the farmers. I pushed the heavy coverlet aside and sat up, my bare feet finding the packed earth floor. The cold shot up through my soles, waking me faster than a splash of water. I moved by memory through the pitch black of the main room, my hand trailing along the rough plaster of the wall, until my fingers found the niche of the hearth. The embers from the night before were buried deep beneath gray ash, sleeping but not extinguished. I knelt, my knees protesting with a dull ache that seemed to grow sharper with every harvest season, and gently blew upon the center of the hearth. A faint orange glow pulsed in the dark, a single eye opening in the void. With a handful of dry twig and a patience born of necessity, I coaxed the fire back to life. When the small flame finally licked upward, casting dancing shadows against the stone walls, I reached for the oil lamp. I poured a small measure of olive oil into the clay vessel, the golden liquid sluggish in the cold. This was the first offering of the day, not to the gods, but to the necessity of sight. As the wick caught the flame, I paused to admire the clear, clean burn. It was my own oil, pressed 2 winters ago, and it burned with a steady light and a scent that reminded me of summer sun hitting green leaves. I stood and moved to the small household altar near the door. It was a modest thing, a shelf of cypress wood holding small clay figures of the household gods. I poured a libation of wine, watered down and dark, into the small bowl, murmuring the prayers my father had taught me and his father before him. I asked Zeus of the courtyard to guard the perimeter, and Hestia to keep the hearth warm. But my most fervent silent plea was to Athena. The harvest was upon us, and the trees were heavy. I asked for dry skies and strong backs. Breakfast was a swift, silent affair. I broke a piece of barley bread, hard as a stone and nearly as dense, and dipped it into a cup of undiluted wine to soften it. The sharp bite of the wine and the nutty, wholesome taste of the barley filled my stomach, settling the hunger that always gnawed at me in the mornings. I ate standing up, watching the square of the window turn from black to a bruised purple. The day was arriving. I dressed quickly, pulling my chiton over my head and fastening the girdle around my waist. The wool was scratchy but warm. I wrapped a cloak around my shoulders against the morning chill. and stepped into my leather sandals, tying the thongs tight around my ankles. I needed to be sure-footed today. The slopes of the grove were treacherous, and a twisted ankle meant a loss of labor I could not afford. Stepping out of the house, the air hit me like a physical weight. It was crisp and smelled intensely of wet earth and pine resin from the distant hills. The sky to the east was lightening, a pale gray bleeding into the darkness, revealing the silhouette of the mountains that ringed our valley. The rooster in the coop crowed, a harsh, grating sound that shattered the morning silence, and was answered by the barking of the shepherd dogs from the neighbor's farm down the valley. I walked to the storage shed to gather the tools. The long poles of hazel wood, smooth from years of handling, leaned against the wall. I took 2 of them, along with the large wicker baskets that would hold the fruit. The wood felt cold and solid in my grip. These poles were extensions of my own arms. I knew exactly how they balanced, how much force to apply to shake the bough without bruising the bark. A damaged tree was a damaged future. My path to the grove took me past the vegetable patch, now mostly brown and sleeping, and up the gentle rise of the hill. As I walked, the purple of the sky began to give way to a soft rose, the fingers of the dawn stretching out to touch the clouds. The light revealed the landscape that was my entire world. The rocky, gray soil of Attica, poor for wheat, but beloved by the olive. And there they were, the trees. There were 400 of them in my care, some planted by me, some by my father, and the oldest ones, with trunks so gnarled and twisted they looked like agonizing giants frozen in stone, planted by ancestors whose names had faded from memory. They were silver-green ghosts in the half-light, their leaves shimmering as a slight breeze rolled down from the mountains. I stopped for a moment, resting the poles on my shoulder, just to look at them. To a city dweller, an olive tree might look like a chaotic mess of branches, but to me, they were order incarnate. Every twist of the trunk told a story of a drought survived or a storm weathered. I reached the section we were to work on that day. The fruit hung black and heavy, shiny with the morning dew. This was the critical moment. If we waited too long, the fruit would overripen, and the oil would be heavy and acidic. If we picked too early, the yield would be low. I reached up and pulled a single olive from a low-hanging branch, squeezing it between my thumb and forefinger. The flesh yielded firmly, staining my skin with a dark, purple juice that felt greasy to the touch. Perfect. The sun finally crested the mountain ridge, and suddenly the gray world burst into color. The limestone rocks glowed white, the soil turned a deep rust red, and the leaves of the trees flashed silver and emerald. The warmth touched my face, a welcome promise that the day would be mild. I set the baskets down and prepared the ground. I unrolled large linen cloths beneath the first tree, spreading them wide to catch the falling fruit. This was tedious work, smoothing out the fabric over the uneven stones and thorny scrub. But not a single olive could be lost to the dirt. An olive that touches the earth tastes of the earth, and I prided myself on oil that tasted only of the fruit and the sun. I began my work alone, as the hired hands would not arrive for another hour. I chose a low branch to start, eschewing the pole for my own hands. I worked with a rhythm that was more instinct than thought. My fingers combed through the foliage, stripping the fruit into the fold of my cloak, or dropping it directly onto the cloths below. The sound of the olives hitting the linen was a soft, percussive rain, tap, tap, thud, tap. It was the music of my life. My mind drifted as my hands worked. I thought of the market in the city, the noise and the haggling. I would have to take the oil there in the spring. I worried about the price the jars would command. I had heard rumors in the village square that ships from the islands had brought a surplus of oil this year, which would drive the value down. If the price was low, we would have to tighten our belts. We would eat more lentils and less fish. We would patch our tunics rather than weave new ones. But that was a worry for the spring. For now, the harvest was the only truth. My shoulders began to warm up, the stiffness of the morning fading into the familiar burn of labor. I moved around the tree, a dance partner to the unmoving wood. The smell of the grove was intensifying. As the sun rose higher, a green, peppery scent released by the bruised leaves and the broken stems. It was a smell that clung to my skin, my hair, and my clothes. No amount of washing in the steaming baths could ever truly remove it. I was made of olive oil as much as I was made of flesh and bone. After a time, I heard voices drifting up the path. It was my son, barely 12 winters old, leading the mule, followed by the 2 men from the village I had hired to help with the beating. My son walked with a seriousness that made my heart ache with pride. He carried the water skins and a sack of dried figs for our midday meal. "Good morning, Father," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "The day is bright, Elian," I replied, stepping back from the tree and wiping my brow with the back of my hand. "The fruit is ready to fall. It barely clings to the stem." The men greeted me with nods and murmured blessings for the work. They were sturdy men, brothers who had no land of their own, but worked with an honesty I respected. We wasted no time in idle chatter. The sun waits for no man, and the day was short. We fell into a coordinated effort. I took the ladder, propping it carefully against a sturdy fork in the trunk, and climbed into the heart of the tree. The brothers took the poles, standing on the ground. Gently, I commanded from my perch, "Do not strike the wood as if it were an enemy. Coax the fruit down." They began to beat the upper branches. The sound changed now, the soft tapping replaced by the rhythmic thwackshush of wood hitting leaf-laden boughs. A dark rain of olives began to cascade down around me, bouncing off my shoulders and head before settling on the white cloths below. I focused on the inner branches, picking by hand where the poles could not reach without causing damage. Up here, surrounded by the gray-green canopy, the world seemed distant. I could see the blue strip of the sea far to the south, glittering like a shield in the sun. I could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of the neighboring farms. I felt a profound sense of connection to this place. My grandfather had stood in this exact crotch of wood, looking at this same view. My son would stand here one day when my knees were too weak to climb. The work was hard. Dust from the bark and leaves filled the air, coating my throat and stinging my eyes. The rough bark scraped my knuckles, and my neck grew stiff from constantly looking up and down. But there was a joy in it too, as the cloths beneath us turned from white to a solid, shimmering black mound of fruit. A sense of security grew in my chest. This was wealth. This was survival. By the time the sun had climbed halfway to its zenith, we had cleared 3 of the large trees. My son was busy gathering the corners of the cloths, funneling the olives into the wicker baskets. He struggled with the weight, his face red with exertion, but he did not ask for help. I watched him from the corner of my eye, ensuring he did not strain himself, but allowing him the dignity of the labor. He was learning the weight of our livelihood. We paused briefly to drink from the water skins. The water was cool, flavored with a sprig of mint my wife had dropped in. I poured a little onto the ground first, a share for the earth that fed us before drinking deeply. The liquid washed away the dust and tasted sweeter than the finest wine. "The yield is good," one of the brothers said, wiping his mouth. "Better than the grove in the valley." "The valley holds the frost too long," I replied, looking at the baskets. "Here on the slope, the air moves. The trees breathe." I looked at the next tree in the line. It was a massive, ancient thing, its trunk hollowed out by time so that a man could stand inside it. Yet its branches were thick with fruit. It was the matriarch of the grove. "Come," I said, capping the water skin. "She is waiting." I picked up the ladder, feeling the wood bite into my shoulder. The morning was passing, slipping through my fingers like the oil we would soon press. There was no time to rest, not while the sun shone and the fruit hung heavy. I stepped forward onto the rocky soil, my sandals finding purchase on the uneven ground, ready to wrestle another harvest from the earth. The ache in my back was a familiar companion, a reminder that I was alive, and that by my hand, the lamps of Athens would burn bright this winter. The sun has climbed to its highest point, hanging directly above the silver-green canopy like a polished shield of bronze. There is a specific weight to the air at this hour, a heavy stillness that presses down on the shoulders of every man working in the grove. My tunic, once light and airy in the chill of the morning, now clings to my back, darkened with the honest sweat of labor. I pause for a moment, leaning my weight against the rough, gnarled trunk of an ancient tree, and wipe my forehead with the back of my forearm. The grit of the earth mixes with the moisture on my skin, turning to a thin paste of dust. We have been at the harvest since the first gray light touched the eastern hills, beating the branches to loosen the fruit that Athena has graciously granted us this season. My hands throb with a dull, rhythmic ache, the result of hours spent gripping the long wooden staff. It is a tool of simplicity, merely a polished length of ash wood. Yet, after 6 hours of swinging it upward into the dense foliage, it feels as heavy as iron. I look up into the tangle of leaves. They are deceptive things, dark green on top, but flashing a brilliant, dusty silver underneath whenever a breeze disturbs them. Today, however, there is no breeze. The leaves are motionless, holding their breath in the midday heat. I can see the olives clinging stubbornly to the twigs, small oval gems ranging from unripe green to a deep, bruising purple. Down below, crouching among the clods of dry earth, my youngest son and our single hired hand, Eumaeus, are gathering the fallen fruit. They move like crabs, scuttling on hands and knees, sweeping the precious harvest into woven baskets. I watch them for a moment, judging their pace. They are slowing down. The heat is a formidable opponent, even for the young. It is time to call a halt. The sun commands it, and my stomach echoes the order. I lower my staff, letting the end rest in the dirt, and clear my throat. The sound is dry and raspy. I call out to them, telling them to leave the baskets and find shade. They look up, their faces streaked with soil, and relief washes over their expressions. We do not speak much. The energy required for conversation is better saved for the work that awaits us in the afternoon. We retreat to the center of the grove, where the great tree stands. This olive tree is older than my father, older than his father before him. Its trunk is a twisted, cavernous sculpture of living wood, split and hollowed by time, yet still producing the sweetest oil in the valley. Its branches spread wide, offering a pool of dense shade that feels 10 degrees cooler than the open field. I sit with my back against the wood, groaning softly as my muscles settle. The ground here is hard, packed down by generations of midday meals, but to my tired legs, it feels as welcoming as a feather bed. Eumaeus unhooks the water skin from a low branch and passes it to me first. I unplug the stopper. The water is tepid, having warmed in the ambient heat, but it tastes of life itself. I drink deeply, letting the liquid wash away the dust that coats the inside of my throat. before passing it to my son. He drinks with the voracious thirst of youth, water spilling down his chin. I watch him with a critical but affectionate eye. He is strong, but he lacks the patience for the trees. He looks often toward the distant ridge that hides the city, dreaming of the gymnasium and the market, of noise and debate. He does not yet understand that the city eats while the country feeds. From a woven sack, I produce our midday meal. It is simple fare, the same as it was yesterday, and the same as it will be tomorrow. I break off chunks of maza, the dense barley cake that is the staple of our lives. It is coarse and requires strong teeth, but it sits heavy and satisfying in the belly. Alongside the bread, there is a wedge of goat cheese, white and sharp, crumbling under the pressure of my thumb. We have a few onions, pulled from the garden this morning, and a handful of dried figs that are sticky with their own sugar. And of course, there are the olives. We eat the ones cured from last year, bitter and salty, preserved in brine. It is a strange cycle, consuming the labor of the past while harvesting the promise of the future. I take a bite of the barley cake, chewing slowly. The silence of the grove is profound. The cicadas, who usually scream their song from the pine trees on the ridge, seem to have taken a respite. The only sound is the crunch of onion and the soft breathing of 3 men at rest. My mind wanders to the yield. The baskets are filling, yes, but are they filling fast enough? The rains were late this year. The trees were thirsty in the month of Hecatomban, and I worried that the fruit would shrivel before it could ripen. I pick up a fallen olive from the ground near my sandaled foot and roll it between my fingers. It is smaller than I would like, but firm. The oil content will be decent, if not bountiful. I calculate silently. 10 baskets today, perhaps 12 if we push hard before twilight. We must leave enough for the press to work efficiently, but not so much that the fruit sits and rots in the storehouse. The pressing is a worry for another day. Today is just for the gathering. I lean my head back against the bark, closing my eyes. The smell of the grove is distinct, a mixture of dry earth, resinous wood, and the faint, peppery scent of crushed olive leaves. It is the smell of my inheritance. My grandfather planted the younger section of this grove after the Great War, when the Persians burned the land. He used to tell me that an olive tree is like a man. It must struggle to grow strong. Give it too much water, too much soft earth, and it grows lazy, producing wood but no fruit. It needs the rocks. It needs the thirst. I feel a drowsiness tugging at my eyelids. The transition from the bright, blinding sun to the cool shade makes the world feel distant. I allow myself to drift, hovering on the edge of sleep. In this state, the aches in my shoulders and lower back seem to detach themselves, becoming dull and far away. I think of the market in the city. I will have to travel there in 2 weeks when the pressing is done. I do not care for the city. It is loud and smells of too many people living too close together. The merchants there have soft hands and sharp tongues, always trying to argue the price of a jar of oil down by 2 obols. They do not know the weight of the staff. They do not know how the frost bites the fingers in deep winter when we must prune the dead wood. They only know the golden liquid that they dip their fine white bread into. But the city needs us. Without the farmer, the philosopher starves. Without the oil, the lamps of the temples go dark, and the athletes have nothing to rub into their skin. We are the foundation, unseen and often unthanked, buried here in the dirt. A fly buzzes near my ear, snapping me back to wakefulness. I brush it away with a weary hand. I open my eyes and look at the sky through the gaps in the leaves. The sun has moved. Not much, but enough. The shadows have lengthened by perhaps the width of a hand. The zenith has passed. I look at Eumius. He is asleep, his head resting on his knees, his breathing slow and deep. My son is awake, whittling a piece of stick with a small knife, staring at nothing. It is time, I say. The words break the spell of the midday rest. Eumius jerks his head up, blinking rapidly as he returns to the world of men. My son sighs, a short, sharp sound of reluctance, but he puts away his knife and stands. I groan as I push myself up. My joints pop, protesting the return to verticality. The brief rest has stiffened me, and the first few movements are always difficult. It takes a moment to straighten my back fully, to feel the spine align. I walk out from the shade of the great tree and back into the glare. The light is different now, less white, more gold, but the heat is still a physical force. I pick up my staff from where I left it. The wood is warm to the touch. I look down the long rows of trees. There are hundreds of them, stretching away toward the stone wall that marks the boundary of my land. Each one waits for me. Each one holds its burden of fruit, waiting to be relieved. It is a relationship of mutual necessity. I tend them, I prune them, I feed their roots, and in return, they give me the means to live. I approach the next tree in the line. It is a younger one, perhaps only 40 years old, with a straight trunk and vigorous growth. I position myself, finding my footing on the uneven ground. I lift the staff, feeling the weight settle into my palms. I do not strike in anger. One must never strike the tree in anger, or you will bruise the wood and invite disease. It must be a firm, calculated tap, enough to shake the branch, but not break it. I swing. Thwack. The sound is crisp and dry. A shower of dark fruit rains down onto the cloth spread below, pattering like a heavy, sudden storm. The rhythm begins again. Swing, strike, recover. Swing, strike, recover. The midday break is over. The afternoon stretches out before us, long and arduous, until the sun dips behind the western peaks and releases us from our duty. Until then, I am simply another part of the grove, as rooted and persistent as the trees themselves. I lift the staff again, and I work. The sun hung directly overhead, a blazing white eye staring down at the rocky hills of Attica. Though the season was turning toward the cooler months, the midday heat still held a formidable weight, pressing against the back of my neck and soaking my tunic with sweat. It was time for the pause, the brief respite that divided the labor of the morning from the long stretch of the afternoon. We had been at the harvest since first light, and my arms ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that matched the pulse in my temples. I signaled to the others, raising a hand to shield my eyes from the glare. My son Thuron was halfway up a wooden ladder, his face flushed and streaked with dust. He nodded, grateful for the signal, and descended carefully, his sandals scraping against the rough bark of the ancient trunk. The hired hands and the few servants who worked our land moved toward the shade of the great plane tree that marked the edge of the grove. This tree was older than my grandfather, perhaps older than the city walls themselves, and its sprawling canopy offered the only true sanctuary from the relentless sky. We sat in a rough circle on the dry earth. The ground was hard, scattered with pebbles and the occasional fallen twig, but to my weary legs, it felt as welcoming as a feathered bed. I reached for the wineskin that hung from a low branch, the leather cool to the touch. I unstoppered it and took a long draught. The wine was watered down, 3 parts water to 1 part wine, just enough to sharpen the mind and cleanse the throat without dulling the senses. The liquid tasted of resin and dark earth, washing away the dust that coated my mouth. From a woven basket, I produced our midday meal. It was simple fare, as it always was during the harvest. There were barley cakes, dense and chewy, baked by my wife before the sun had risen. Along with the bread, we had a wedge of goat cheese, sharp and salty, and a handful of figs dried from the summer prior. But the centerpiece, as always, was the oil. I poured a small measure of the previous year's press into a shallow clay bowl. It was golden and thick, smelling of green grass and pepper. We dipped the barley cakes into it, letting the oil soften the grain. This was the fruit of our labor, the very essence of the land we tended, fueling us to harvest the new crop. Conversation was sparse. The silence was filled only by the chewing of food and the persistent, chirping chorus of insects hidden in the dry grass. We were all too tired for idle chatter. I watched Thuron as he ate. He was becoming a man, his shoulders broadening, his hands growing calloused and capable. He frowned slightly as he looked out at the rows of trees, likely calculating how much work remained. I knew that look well. It was the burden of the farmer, the eternal worry that the rains would come too soon or the frost would bite before the jars were full. I leaned back against the trunk of the plane tree and closed my eyes for a moment. The scent of the grove drifted over me. It is a smell unlike any other, a mixture of dusty earth, the sharp tang of bruised olive leaves, and the faint, sweet decay of overripe fruit that had fallen early. Behind my eyelids, I could still see the shimmering silver green of the leaves dancing in the wind. I allowed myself to drift, not into sleep, but into a state of deep rest, listening to the wind rattle the dry branches. The rest could not last forever. The sun began its slow descent, shifting the shadows and changing the light from a blinding white to a warmer golden hue. I stood up, groaning slightly as my joints protested the movement, and clapped my hands. It was time to return. The afternoon shift was often the most difficult. The initial energy of the morning was gone, and the anticipation of the evening meal was still hours away. It required a steady, rhythmic determination. I walked to the tree we had abandoned earlier. It was a gnarled giant, its trunk twisted like a wrung-out cloth. I picked up my rhabdos, the long, flexible beating stick made of polished hazel wood. This tool was an extension of my arm. The key was not to strike the tree with fury, for that would damage the tender shoots that would bear fruit the following year. Instead, the motion had to be precise, a sharp tap against the laden branches to shake the olives loose without harming the wood. I reached up, tapping the high branches. The sound was distinct, a dry clack followed by the soft, pattering rain of olives falling onto the linen cloths we had spread beneath the canopy. Plip, plip, plip. It sounded like the onset of a heavy rainstorm. The olives were small, black and shiny, perfect for oil. We did not grow the large, fleshy fruit meant for eating at the table. Our trade was the liquid gold that lit the lamps of Athens and cleaned the bodies of athletes in the gymnasium. Thuron took the ladder again, climbing high into the crown of the tree to reach the fruit that defied our sticks. I watched him with a mixture of pride and anxiety. A fall from that height could result in a broken limb, a disaster for a family that relied on every pair of hands. Keep 3 points of contact, I shouted up to him, my voice rough. Do not stretch too far. The olives at the tip are not worth your neck. He grunted in acknowledgement, hooking his arm around a thick branch as he shook the leaves. A cascade of black fruit rained down, bouncing off my shoulders and head. I brushed them off and knelt to begin the gathering. This was the work that broke the back. Bending at the waist, I swept the fallen olives into the center of the cloths. I had to be careful to separate them from the twigs and leaves that had fallen with them. The purity of the oil depended on the cleanliness of the press. If too many leaves went into the mill, the oil would be bitter. My hands were stained dark from the juice of the fruit, and the oil that seeped from the skins made my fingers slick. I worked in a rhythm, kneeling, sweeping, lifting, and pouring the harvest into the woven baskets. The baskets were heavy, and when one was full, I hoisted it onto my shoulder and carried it to the cart waiting at the edge of the row. The donkey flicked its ears and swished its tail, impatient with the flies. As the afternoon wore on, the light changed again. The harsh shadows lengthened and softened, painting the hills in shades of violet and burnt orange. The heat broke, replaced by a cooling breeze that rolled down from the mountains. This was the golden hour, the time when the olive grove looked most beautiful. The leaves, silver on the underside, rippled like water in the breeze. It was easy to believe, in moments like this, that the goddess Athena herself walked between the rows, inspecting her gift to our city. I paused to wipe the sweat from my brow with the back of my forearm. My tunic clung to my skin, heavy with dust and perspiration. I looked at the progress we had made. 3 trees fully cleared, their branches light and lifted, relieved of their burden. The baskets in the cart were piled high. It was a good day's work, though my lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that I knew would follow me into sleep. I moved to the next tree, a younger one with smoother bark. Here, I did not need the ladder. I could reach most of the branches while standing on the ground. I worked alongside one of the older hands, a man named Iason, who had worked these hills for 40 years. We worked in companionable silence, our sticks clacking in unison. There is a language in labor that requires no words. We knew when to step back, when to move the cloth, when to switch sides. The sun was now dipping low, turning the western horizon into a forge of glowing embers. The light caught the dust motes in the air, turning the grove into a hazy, dreamlike landscape. I felt a deep, resonant satisfaction. It is a hard life, farming the olive. It requires patience that spans years. You plant a tree not for yourself, but for your children. You prune it in the winter, worrying about the frost. You watch the blossoms in the spring, praying the winds do not strip them away. And then, finally, in the autumn, you collect the reward. I lifted one last basket, the wicker creaking under the weight. The smell of the olives was overpowering now, a rich, oily scent that coated the inside of my nose. I walked to the cart and heaved it up, settling it against the others. The donkey shifted its weight, sensing that the work was nearly done. "That is enough for today," I announced, my voice sounding loud in the quiet of the twilight. "The light is failing. We risk missing the fruit in the shadows." Thuron climbed down from his ladder, stretching his arms high above his head and twisting his torso to work out the stiffness. We began the process of folding the linen cloths, shaking them out to ensure no stray olives were left behind. The cloths were stained with dark circles where boots had crushed the fruit, a map of our day's labor. As we packed the tools, the ladders, the sticks, the rakes, I took a moment to inspect a handful of the harvested olives in the nearest basket. They were firm and dark, shining in the fading light. I squeezed one between my thumb and forefinger. It yielded easily, releasing a drop of dark fluid. This would be a good year. The oil would be sweet and clear. We began the slow walk back toward the farmhouse, leading the laden donkey. The cart creaked and rattled over the uneven ground, a familiar song that signaled the end of the shift. The air was rapidly cooling, the heat of the day radiating up from the stones, but leaving the air crisp. I could smell wood smoke from the farmhouse chimney, promising a warm fire and a hot meal. My thoughts turned to the evening ahead. There would be the washing of feet, the scraping of oil and dirt from our skin, and the simple joy of sitting without the demand of movement. We would talk of the market prices and the weather for tomorrow. But for now, as the blue twilight settled over the grove, I felt only the heavy, pleasant exhaustion of a day well spent. I walked with my hand resting on the flank of the donkey, feeling the warmth of the animal, guiding our harvest home under the watching eyes of the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. The afternoon was over. The time of rest was near. The last sliver of the sun retreated behind the western ridges, casting long, violet shadows across the grove. The twisted trunks of the olive trees, which had looked silver and green under the noon glare, now turned into dark, gnarled silhouettes against the dimming sky. My shoulders ached with a dull, familiar throb, the kind that settles into the bones after 12 hours of labor. But it was a good ache. It was the feeling of a day well spent, of duties fulfilled to the land and the gods. I wiped the sweat and dust from my forehead with the back of my hand, leaving a smear of grime on my skin. The air was cooling rapidly, the sharp bite of the coming autumn evening replacing the heat. Around me, the sounds of the harvest were fading. The rhythmic thumping of poles against branches had ceased, and the voices of the hired hands and the household servants had quieted to low murmurs as they gathered the last of the fallen fruit into the woven baskets. We were not finished, however. During the harvest, the work does not end when the light fails. I made my way to the pressing shed, a low stone structure on the edge of the courtyard. The air inside was thick, heavy with the pungent, grassy scent of crushed olives. It is a smell that permeates everything I own, from my tunic to my hair, a scent that signifies life and prosperity. Inside, the oil lamp had already been lit, its small flame dancing in the draft and illuminating the heavy wooden beam of the press. 2 of the men were tightening the windlass, their muscles straining as they pulled the rope that lowered the massive beam onto the stack of frails. Woven mats filled with the pulp of the olives we had crushed earlier in the day. I watched the mechanism closely. The beam creaked, a sound like a ship adjusting to the sea. And then, slowly, the dark liquid began to weep from the mats. It flowed down the stone channels into the waiting basin, a mixture of precious oil and the bitter watery dregs we call amurca. I stepped closer, dipping a finger into the stream. It was warm and slick. This was the lifeblood of our farm. In a few days, after it settled in the great clay pithy buried in the cool earth of the storeroom, the golden oil would rise to the top, ready to be skimmed. It would be sold in the agora, used to light our lamps, to cleanse our bodies at the gymnasium, and to dress our food. I nodded to the men, signaling them to hold the pressure. We would leave the beam, weighted through the night. The steady drip, drip, drip of the oil into the basin was the only sound in the shed, a rhythm more soothing to me than any music from a lyre. Leaving the shed, I walked across the beaten earth of the courtyard toward the main house. The chickens had already roosted, and the goats were penned, their soft bleating settling down into silence. The house was a simple structure of sun-dried brick and timber, organized around the central open air of the courtyard. I could see the glow of the hearth fire spilling out from the room where the women worked. As I washed my feet and hands at the basin near the door, scrubbing away the sticky residue of the olives, my wife, Eleni, stepped out. She carried a clay jug, her face illuminated by the firelight from within. She looked tired, her hands dusted with flour, but her eyes were sharp. She asked if the pressing went well, her voice low. I told her the yield looked heavy, perhaps better than the previous year. A brief look of relief crossed her face. A good yield meant we could trade for better wool this winter, perhaps even repair the roof tiles that had cracked during the summer heat. We entered the main room, the andren being reserved for guests, and tonight it was only the family. The room was warm, smelling of wood smoke and baking barley. My son Nikos was already seated on a low stool. He was 12 years old, his limbs lengthening, his hands starting to callous like mine. He had spent the day carrying baskets, a task that strains the back, but he sat straight, trying to show he was not weary. I placed a hand on his shoulder as I passed, a silent acknowledgement of his effort. He looked up, a smudge of dirt on his cheek, and offered a tired smile. Dinner was simple, as it always is on working days. We ate maza, the staple barley cake that sustains all of Greece. It was dense and filling. Alongside it, Eleni had set out a bowl of olives from our own trees, cured in brine, and a wedge of sharp goat cheese. There were also dried figs, sweet and chewy, to balance the salt of the cheese. I mixed the wine in the crater, careful with the proportions. 3 parts water to 1 part wine. It was a vintage from 3 years ago, resonated with pine, rough, but invigorating. I poured a small amount into a cup and turned toward the hearth in the center of the room. The flames licked at the blackened stones. Hestia, guardian of the home, deserved the first share. I tipped the cup, letting a stream of wine hiss into the fire. I murmured the prayers that my father had taught me and his father before him. I thanked the gods for the harvest, for the health of my household, and asked for protection through the night. The smoke rose straight up toward the vent in the roof, a good omen. We ate mostly in silence. The day's labor leaves little energy for idle chatter. I tore a piece of the barley cake, using it to scoop up the cheese. The flavors were earthy and honest. As I chewed, my mind drifted to the tasks for tomorrow. The western grove still needed to be cleared. The weather had held so far clear skies and mild winds. But in the month of Pipeshin, the storms could roll in from the sea with little warning. If the rains came while the fruit was still on the branch, the olives would bruise and rot. I looked at Nikos. He was fighting to keep his eyes open, his chewing slow and rhythmic. I spoke to him then, my voice raspy from the dust. I told him that tomorrow he would help with the beating of the high branches. His eyes widened slightly. It was a step up from carrying baskets. It required balance and a careful hand so as not to damage the tree for the coming years. It was a small promotion, but to a boy, it meant he was becoming a man. He nodded, sleep vanishing for a moment, replaced by pride. When the meal was finished, Eleni cleared the bowls. I remained by the hearth for a time, watching the embers glow. The warmth seeped into my legs, easing the stiffness. This time of sitting, between the meal and sleep, is the only true leisure a farmer knows during the harvest. I thought of the city miles away. Men there were likely discussing politics in the assembly, or watching a play, debating philosophy under the stoas. Their lives seemed distant, almost foreign. My philosophy was written in the soil and the seasons. My assembly was the rows of trees that had stood on this land since my grandfather planted them. The oil lamp was flickering low, the wick needing a trim, but I did not tend to it. It was time to rest. I stood, my joints popping, and went to check the door bolts. Security is a habit one does not break. The countryside is mostly peaceful, but travelers and vagrants sometimes wander from the road, and a storehouse full of oil is a temptation. The heavy wooden bar slid into place with a solid thud. I walked out into the courtyard one last time before bed. The sky was fully dark now, a vast dome of black velvet pierced by thousands of stars. The air was cold, causing me to pull my tunic tighter around me. I looked up, finding the familiar constellations. The Pleiades were high. The season was turning. Soon the harvest would be over, the rains would come and the earth would sleep. I listened to the night. An owl hooted in the distance, a mournful, hollow sound. The wind rustled the olive leaves, a sound like dry whispering. Everything was in order. The press was weighted, the animals were safe, the family was fed. I returned inside to the small room where we slept. The mattress was stuffed with dried reeds and wool, resting on a raised wooden frame. It was not soft by the standards of a wealthy merchant, but to my tired body, it felt like a cloud. I lay down, pulling the heavy wool blanket up to my chin. Eleni blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint red glow from the hearth in the main room. I could hear the rhythmic breathing of my son from the corner, already deep in slumber. I closed my eyes, but my mind did not shut off immediately. I saw the olives falling, a cascade of black rain. I felt the vibration of the pole in my hands. I calculated the jars we would fill. 100 jars, perhaps more. Enough to pay the tax, enough to buy the tools we needed, enough to store for the year. The anxiety that sits in the pit of my stomach all summer, the fear of drought, of blight, of locusts, began to loosen its grip. The fruit was safe. We had succeeded. The weariness finally overtook my thoughts. The ache in my shoulders dulled into a heavy numbness. As I drifted toward sleep, the smell of the olive oil from the pressing shed seemed to follow me. A rich, golden scent that promised survival. Tomorrow, before the sun rose, I would rise again. I would walk out to the trees. I would take up the pole, and I would continue the work that sustains us. But for now, the night belonged to us,